Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. More than a week on from the local elections and it seems we're no closer to a return to Stormont. Sinn Fein was the big winner last week. The party leader, Mary Lou McDonald, joins me from Dublin. Plus, a new report suggests deprivation has contributed to a lack of reconciliation here. The report's author is with me in the studio. And here with his assessment of that and more, Belfast Live's political reporter, Brendan Hughes. Last week's local election results saw nationalist parties win more votes than unionists for the first time in the history of Northern Ireland. That result has provoked a lot of discussion on when a border poll should or should not happen. On Wednesday, Sir John Major suggested the criteria for the calling of a referendum on Irish unity should be clearly set out. Let's hear what the Sinn Féin President, Mary Lou McDonald, thinks. She joins me now live from Dublin. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Nationalists won more votes than unionist parties 10 days ago, but of course neither side has an overall majority. Do you accept the conditions for calling a border poll have not yet been met?
Well, I've said to you many times, Mark, and more importantly, perhaps I've shared the view with the Taoiseach, with successive Taoiseach, that we need to begin preparations now. We're not going to head into a referendum without having had a very broad-based conversation, discussion and planning. And I think the election, which was historic, another historic first, demonstrates again that change is underway, that change is happening, that the pace of it is quite rapid, and that we need to talk to each other, we need to prepare, and we need to grasp the incredible opportunities that lie ahead for all of us that live on this island. So that, for me, is the absolute priority now, and the government in Dublin needs to lead in this regard. We have said many times that it's now the time to call a citizens' assembly, to bring together a space, a recognised formal space for these conversations and exchanges to take place from stakeholders right across Irish society, north and south, east and west.
We don't, of course, know what the criteria are at this stage. We know what the Good Friday Agreement says. You've got someone now like Sir John Major, former British Conservative Prime Minister, saying it is time for us to know precisely where the bar is and what it looks like. Do you have a clear idea in your mind where that bar is?
Well, look, I agree with John Major, and in fact, this is something that Sinn Féin has raised with successive Prime Ministers, that needs to be set out very, very clearly. Thus far, the British government has flatly refused to share with us what they believe would be the moment that a referendum might be triggered. But I think John Major is correct on the back now of two very, very significant elections with an eye to the change that's happening. And it's quite profound, I think, right across Irish society and in the north. That they should set out those that criteria now. I would urge them to do so, and I think that would give a level of clarity and some shape to the wider conversation. But let me be clear, even if the British government continues to dodge this issue, even if they maintain the position of saying we don't have to set out the criteria, that should not stop the rest of us doing what needs to be done. Because let me say, Mark, you know, there will be no prizes for those who buried their head in the sand. Change is happening. It is absolutely critically important that it's managed in an orderly and an inclusive and a respectful way.
OK, but it's interesting you say change is happening. It is arguable, is it not, that change is happening at a snail's pace. The combined nationalist vote, including People Before Profit and independent nationalists 10 days ago, is 43.5%, according to the respected data analyst Peter Donaghy. The combined unionist vote is 39.4%. So that does not suggest a majority of people would vote for constitutional change as things currently stand. So I'm just going to ask you again, what do you think the criteria should be? What elections should we be taking into account, and over how long a sustained period, for us to know that a border poll might be appropriate and people would vote for change?
Well, look, we're 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, and of course, this central component of that is provision for a referendum, for a border poll. So the time is now, is the answer to your question, and you'll have heard me say many, many times that these referendums will happen in the course of this decade. I can't give you a precise date at this juncture. What I can say to you is that the preparation for those referendums needs to get underway now. There is an urgency around that. And just remember, Mark, whatever way the numbers are crunched and the data is analysed, Sinn Fein in the election scored an historic first, the largest local mandate ever secured by any political party in the north since the 1970s. So to try and play that down, to try and play down the emergence of the other space in northern politics, to try and play down the very significant social changes and demographic changes that are underway, I think is a mistake. And remember this also, you know, people understandably will focus on the question of the ending of partition, of reunification, of a new Ireland, when we start to flesh out exactly what that means, and when people understand very fully that they're not spectators, that everybody, all of us, every section of our people will have a hand in designing and deciding what that new Ireland looks like. OK,
sorry, there's a slight delay on the line here, so I'm mindful of that. But I just wanted to say to you, I don't think anybody's playing down the significance of Sinn Féin's electoral success last week. But you will know very well the Good Friday Agreement says the Secretary of State shall call a border poll if at any time it appears likely to him, or presumably her, that a majority of those voting would express a wish that Northern Ireland should cease to be part of the United Kingdom and form part of a united Ireland. And I'm simply saying to you that if you look at the combined nationalist vote last time round at 43.5%, you are nowhere near clearing the bar of 50% plus one.
But equally, can I say to you that those who would argue for the maintenance of the union are well below, fall well short of that 50% threshold.
Well, so in the numbers,
if you want. Well, exactly. Well, you're making my point for me. That's precisely the point. So in terms of the data and the stats, I mean, arguably we are at the point now in these times where the calling of referendums will not only be defensible but absolutely necessary. But the reality of this, because this has to work for everybody, this is about a win for everybody on this island. The reality is that we will not go to the polls on a referendum in the absence of engagement, preparation and planning. We saw how that worked out for our neighbours across the water in the Brexit context. We will not be so foolish as to make that mistake again. I want everybody to be involved and have a stake in all of this. And that's the important work that needs to happen now.
Do you think it was a failure of nationalism on reflection, just briefly, to fail to nail down the clear specifics of the terms that need to be met when the Good Friday Agreement was being negotiated 25 years ago?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think when that agreement was struck, it was a whole series of strategic compromises and accommodations that made that agreement possible. And at that point in time, I think the best bargain that could be struck was struck on this. The central point is that it is for the Irish people, for all of us on this island who share this place as home, to decide our future together by means of a referendum. And those referendums will happen. They will happen in the coming years. There's no doubt in my mind about that. What I am doubtful about is the capacity now of the current government in Dublin and the government in London to be alive and aware of and responsive to the extent of the change and simply to make preparations for it. Nobody should be afraid of this conversation. This is about opportunity. We all need to be involved, and the governments, particularly in Dublin, need to lead in that regard.
Well, it's pretty obvious that the current Taoiseach Leo Varadkar doesn't share your view, because he was talking to the Irish Times yesterday and he said very clearly the conditions for a border poll are not right. He said the push for a border poll, I think, is counterproductive. What we need to do is to make the Good Friday Agreement work, get the Assembly, the Executive, the North-South south and east-west bodies functioning and functioning well, and then have the conversation between the governments and with the parties about what changes we might be able to make. So he's not on the same page as you at the moment. He's the Taoiseach, you're not.
Well, that is the case, and he is on the wrong page. I mean, we all know, we know full well that we need the executive back up and running. We need a functioning assembly. We need the east-west institutions to work. We need the north-south piece to work as well. And you can do all of those things and at the same time have the kind of engagement and planning that I'm describing. The political system and political leaders have to have a capacity to multitask and do several things, several important, critical things at the same time.
Okay.
So I think to advance an argument that we will not prepare for the medium and long-term future simply because we have challenges in the present, that doesn't stack up. That's not responsible politics, in my view.
There are a couple of other issues I want to talk to you about as well. So just briefly on this, staying with the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, he also told the Irish Times yesterday that the Republic could co-fund some projects here in Northern Ireland because that might help the situation in the north where there's a real budget squeeze. And he cited the co-funding of the A5 road to Derry as an example. Do you agree with him, I wonder? And should other projects, perhaps like Casement Park, be considered as well?
Well, I think firstly we need to confront the fact that the British state, the Tory government, consistently fails to fund the North correctly. I think we also have to confront the fact that the necessary fiscal powers that the executive needs to really operate at full tilt have not been devolved. And we need to collectively recognise that reliance on a block grant in the medium and long term is not the way that we're going to build a thriving economy and strong public services. And that brings us back to the conversation that we've had around unity and the new Ireland. But as regards Dublin, certainly the Exchequer the coffers are full. We're running record surpluses here. We need to invest that money very smartly, and infrastructure is the smart investment. And certainly as regards the A5, the fact that we're still talking about this project so many years on tells its own story. Investment in infrastructural projects on an all-island basis is the right way to go. The northwest in particular, Derry, Donegal, Strabane, all of that area has been left behind, north of or west of the Shannon equally. So we need a thoughtful, joined-up plan as to how monies are invested for the future. And certainly you won't be surprised to hear that we are very open to Dublin being an active partner in these big infrastructural projects. But let me say this, that does not take for a second the obligation on the British government, the Tory government, to step up to the plate, to reverse the real damage that will be done by their budget. We're looking at market services, some of them closing at the end of June, and yet we're hearing nonsense from people suggesting that perhaps we might have an executive back up and running in the autumn time. That to me is utterly farcical and completely unacceptable.
One last question about something which broke just this morning, if you don't mind. The NIO Minister, Lord Kane, has said plan changes to the government's legacy proposals would ensure the new system is more robustly compliant, as he put it, with international law and more acceptable to victims. Has Sinn Fein been made aware of what those proposed changes look like?
No, we haven't, and it's hard to see. It's hard to see how this legislation could be amended to make it compliant with human rights standards and international law. I think it's unamendable. So if government is serious about actually having a system that works, that meets the needs of victims and survivors from all sides, that's human rights compliant with international law, then they need to withdraw this legislation and return back to the original Stormont House framework and agreement.
OK, need to leave it there. We're out of time. Appreciate your time, Mary Lou McDonald. Thanks very much indeed for joining us from Dublin today. Let's get some analysis of that from Brendan Hughes, who's sitting alongside me and has been listening to that. Let's talk about Mary Lou McDonald's border poll comments, first of all. She's clear that the conversation about constitutional change needs to happen now, but not clear about precisely what the terms for a border poll should be or when it should happen.
Yeah, I think that Sinn Féin has really come to the conclusion in recent years that this is a long-term project for the party. We are no longer seeing in the wake of elections where Sinn Féin previously would have been calling for a border poll immediately. We didn't see that in the wake of this local government election and the counting that took place last weekend. Instead, it's been left to others really to discuss the idea of a border poll. And this is really the first, I suppose, full and proper comments we've heard from the Sinn Féin leadership about the idea of a border poll following that local government election. I think Sinn Féin really is looking at the long game here. They know that, based on the polling, as you pointed out to Mary Lou McDonald, it suggests that we don't have a majority in relation to having Irish unity. There's also no majority in relation to maintaining the union, but there is this middle ground of unaligned voters who are agnostic on the constitutional question, which still need to be won over from both camps.
Is it your view that what Sinn Féin is really saying is, when we have a border poll, we need to be sure that we win the border poll, and there is no point? It would be detrimental to Irish Republicans' cause to have a border poll that's lost.
Yeah, I think that really Brexit has totally changed the dynamic in relation to this. Previously, as I said, where Sinn Féin would have been calling for a border poll to be happening tomorrow. Now, because of Brexit and the way that that worked out, and because of the problems that that has caused across these islands, Sinn Féin doesn't want to have a similar sort of referendum without a plan in place. And I suppose that's why Mary Lou McDonald and others within Sinn Féin have been calling for the Irish government to set up some sort of citizens' assembly where the detail of a border poll and the detail of what a future new Ireland, as they would describe it, what that would look like. But I think critics would question, why has Sinn Féin, I suppose, as the lead nationalist party, lead Republican party, and others within nationalism, why have they spent so long not setting out what they want to see in a future Ireland? Surely at this point they would have a fair idea what they want to see in a united Ireland.
It's interesting if you just reflect on today's interview and what Emma Little-Pengelly said on The View on Thursday night. The Financial Times reported the DUP had raised the border poll issue with the UK government in ongoing talks. And when I asked Emma Little-Pengelly specifically about that, she wouldn't give me a clear yes or no answer. But what do you read into that?
Well, I think it was very telling that Emma Little-Pengelly wasn't really able to answer that question, and therefore that will raise suspicions as to what is at play here for the DUP. I think it's very clear what path we're moving on in relation to returning to the power-sharing institutions. The DUP wants some sort of concession or move from the UK government, which in their view would be something that they could sell to their electorate as maintaining Northern Ireland's place within the Union. And so therefore some question around the border poll could be an issue that they will be looking at. But then, of course, we're looking at the financial package as well.
Well, and that's just what I want to ask you about. Finally, very quickly on this, how do you think Mary Lou McDonald's constituents in Dublin might feel about her support for contributions coming for infrastructure projects in Northern Ireland from taxpayers in the Republic?
Well, it's a difficult balance, really, that Sinn Féin is trying to tread in relation to this. But of course, I think for Sinn Féin voters, they want to see greater cooperation across the island. And so therefore, things like the A5 infrastructure projects, which, as Mary Lou McDonald said, would also benefit places like County Donegal in the Republic of Ireland, that would be something I think that a lot of Sinn Féin voters would be able to get on board with.
OK. Brendan, thank you very much for now. We'll talk to you again a little bit later in the programme. Now, a new report from the pivotal think tank has examined the twin challenges of promoting reconciliation and tackling deprivation here in Northern Ireland. It asks how these issues could be addressed to make this a better place to live, study and work in for young people. And Watt from Pivotal is with me now. Welcome to you. Your report's main conclusion is that ongoing deprivation and a lack of societal integration have contributed significantly to an absence of reconciliation. How much more difficult will that get, do you think, if Stormont's proposed cuts go ahead?
I think we're in a really challenging environment at the minute, Mark. Clearly, you know, week after week on your programme and others, we're hearing about cuts to services, particularly those that support the most disadvantaged people. So things like Sure Start, extended schools, happy, healthy minds, holiday hunger payments, that sort of thing. So I think in this report that we published this week, we really highlighted how ongoing deprivation in communities is a barrier to reconciliation. And my concern would be with all the potential spending cuts that we're looking at, that situation is going to get even worse because we know that there's such reliance on those programmes in our most disadvantaged communities who are seeing that deprivation just continuing on through the generations.
Yeah, and that is a point that you highlight in the report. A lot of community groups that rely on non-statutory grants are, of course, those most at risk from government cuts. Those are the organisations on the front line, and that's where the cutting is already happening.
Yeah, and if we look at where there's been success in community development and in reconciliation, it's often with those local community voluntary sector groups, and they're under threat at the minute. You know, it's the youth work, it's the after schools programmes, it's the work that happens in the evenings, and they're under serious threat at the minute. And I suppose we're highlighting that if we want to build a more reconciled community, then we need to maintain those kind of services and also make sure we're getting the very best from the statutory services as well.
But I mean, it is ironic, is it not, that 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, the report highlights the lack of economic peace dividends in those areas worst impacted by the Troubles. You would think a quarter of a century on, we would have dealt with a lot of that baggage, and clearly we haven't.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge message in our report, that we're not just still divided along community lines, but we're also very divided in terms of who has benefited from the peace dividend. So in this research, we went and we talked to 15 representatives of community groups, academics, people who have real expertise in this area, and they highlighted how, you know, there's been benefits economically to some groups and some people in Northern Ireland, but really there's a lot of communities that have been left behind. And just to quote one bit of our report, this is from a community worker, so this is an article by The Detail a couple of weeks ago, but he said, "I don't know if there's anybody would say that the actual quality of life is massively different from 1998. Peace is about prosperity, peace is about jobs, about hope, about collaboration, about investment. It has to be better. It can't just be the same without the violence." And I think there's a sense in lots of communities that it may be more peaceful than it was before the Good Friday Agreement, but really, apart from that, not a great deal has changed.
Do you think that that situation is highlighted by the political deficit that we have at the moment, the fact that we do not have a functioning devolved administration? Does that simply underscore the difficulties, the institutional difficulties that we have here?
You know, we haven't had government for 40% of the time since the Good Friday Agreement, more than 4 out of the last 6 years. If we are going to break down the barriers in our community, we need strong leadership and we need strong policies put in place that are followed through. I think we saw a lot of ambition at the time of the Good Friday Agreement about greater integration, but in our research in this report, I think a lot of the messages we got were that has gradually been watered down over time, that it's not so much of a political focus, and of course that's made even worse when we don't actually have a functioning executive at all.
Yeah, it isn't all negative. We need to be very clear about that. You do say in the report that there have been valuable programmes of activity in communities which have undoubtedly impacted positively on the lives of many young people. And that's important to make that point.
It's really important to make that point. And I think if you look at the evaluation evidence which we've done about individual peace-building programmes, it comes out as very positive. Young people find it helpful. They build relationships. It changes their attitudes. They have a greater understanding. But I think what we've highlighted in the report is that hasn't moved the dial in terms of society as a whole. And I think then that makes us look back at, you know, the key foundations of society and how we live day to day. Look at education, look at housing. Despite people wanting integrated education, wanting more mixed housing, we still have very divided systems.
Yeah, and I suppose the question is, do you think if we had Stormont back sooner rather than later, we referenced again the possibility of it being back in the autumn, things have a better chance of improving? Because there is no silver bullet, and we need to be clear about that.
Yeah, of course, these issues are long-running, they're complex. I think clearly, if we had politicians back, there'd be more chance of addressing them, but politicians are going to come back with a huge to-do list. This is just one of many things on that list. OK, interesting to hear your thoughts today. Thanks very much indeed, Anne Watt, for coming in to talk to us. And Brendan's still with me just for a final word. I mean, that lays it out in pretty stark terms, the scale of the mountain that our politicians will have to climb if and when Stormont comes back.
Yeah, well, I think what is set out in the pivotal report is, of course, concerning to people, this idea of continued segregation and a lack of reconciliation within our society 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. But I think for a lot of people watching, it won't be particularly surprising that that continues to permeate our society. Clearly, there are questions over what the executive, whenever it has been up and running, has been able to do to try and address those sorts of areas. We continue to have divided schools, divided communities, and that is causing these sorts of problems. And of course, that will be something that could be better addressed if there is a power-sharing executive in place. But history has shown that previous executives haven't been exactly forthcoming in trying to address those problems themselves.
Yeah, and of course there is a narrative. Maybe it's a knee-jerk reaction to what we've been discussing that suggests this segregation is inherently bad, it costs money, it divides communities, it needs to be removed. But actually on the front line, and I think the report references this fact, there are clearly individuals and organisations and communities on the front line which are not happy about the removal of that segregation at the moment because it makes them feel safe.
Well, yeah, I think that there clearly is an area where there needs to address the underlying problems within communities and the deprivation that people are facing within some areas, because that is the issue that needs to be addressed, first of all, before they have the confidence to reach out to other communities. I think that that was an interesting point in the report. So clearly, I think in terms of the finances of Northern Ireland, in terms of where we are directing money, those are the areas that should be addressed first, perhaps, in comparison to looking at the reconciliation piece, which could be a much more long-term strategy.
Do you think many of our politicians have sleepless nights thinking about this kind of stuff?
I don't think that they may do so, because I suppose they're focused on their particular areas. And what we have seen in the past in terms of the power-sharing executive, particularly when it's been a five-party executive, is that departments are really silos, that ministers work for themselves or for their parties, and that there isn't that cohesive, joined-up thinking. So I think that if there is an executive back in the coming months, people are talking about potentially autumn, then I think that there needs to be much more joined-up thinking between departments and between parties if we really want to tackle issues such as this.
OK, it's a huge conversation for sure, and it's good to touch on a programme like this. Thanks very much, Brendan. That's just about it. Just before we go, though, a quick reminder about our Red Lines podcast.